everyone. We'll just wait a couple of minutes for people to join. Hi everyone. I'm just going to wait a couple more minutes and then we can start. Okay, I think we can start. Hi everyone, thank you for tuning in today. My name is Shreya Adhikari and we're going to be talking about what went down at one of the biggest climate conferences, the COP28 in Dubai this year. The Conference of Parties, or COP, is an annual conference where United Nations member states convene to assess and discuss climate goals and plan for climate action. Chatting with us today is Shloka Nath, the CEO of the India Climate Collaborative, or ICC, a first of its kind India-focused collaborative that seeks to direct funding and visibility towards climate action in India. I am just going to see if I can add Shloka's here. Yes.
Hi.
Hi Shloka. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Are you still in Dubai?
No, we're back on Indian soil, very tired, but definitely back home. But great to be doing this conversation, and thank you so much for reaching out to the ICC.
Yes, absolutely. No, so I mean, just coming off from there, you've been there at Dubai, seeing the actual life. So just for people who are tuning in who may not have kept up with everything, could you give
Yeah.
us 3 to 4 highlights of what happened at COP28? This was the year of the global stocktake,
Yeah.
where countries were discussing, taking stock of their climate goals since the 2015 Paris Agreement. So, what were some of the highlights? How did India fare?
Firstly, it's been a myriad of emotions. It's also interesting because it hasn't technically finished yet. It was due to sort of wrap up on the 11th of December, which is Monday. But most COPs actually overrun. And so you'll always find like it extended by a few days, and then there's this flurry of activity and breaking news about sort of deals or rather negotiations around final, statements and submissions. So it is a very sort of it is a very emotional affair for many people, those who attend, and of course for all of the countries that put so much into things like the global stock take. So I do want to point out that emotions are very high, and not everyone is going to be very happy with what has happened at COP or the processes around it. But I think there are some notable things to take away from things like the global stock take this year, for instance. So one is, of course, that really adaptation has been brought to the forefront. And I cannot tell you, Shreya, what a huge win this is, because global climate dialogues historically have always been focused around emissions reduction. And while that is incredibly important, I don't think it's really taken into account the urgency around needing to deal with or adapt to really the impacts of current climate actions or change rather. So I think adaptation being brought to the forefront in the way that it has been a big sort of win in some senses. It is a huge priority for India, of course. 3 out of 4 districts across India are extremely vulnerable to extreme weather events. And just to give you some very quick figures, the government of India has spent already over 5% of its GDP on adaptation, I think in the year 2021 to 2022 alone. So you're seeing, not only a large chunk of our GDP going towards sort of just combating the effects of climate action or climate change rather, but also the government is going to spend more and more in this regard. So adaptation is a really critical priority for India. The second thing that is really important is that, I think we've spelled out consistently, as have many other developing nations, that there is a need for more finance. In order to achieve these adaptation goals, developing and very sort of climate vulnerable countries like India, they require more commitment, they require more adaptation finance from the developed world. So again, just to give you the sort of historical context, global political commitment has historically really focused around mitigation finance. And so again, sort of trying to get adaptation finance to the forefront and the need to really focus on that, I think is a real urgency. The gap right now in terms of adaptation finance, I think is estimated anywhere between USD, close to 200 billion to, I would say, over 350 billion. Like that's the range that we're looking at per year. And this is, don't quote me, this is the UN Adaptation Gap Report that states these figures. So again, the draft global stocktake text right now, it calls for developed countries to really step up when it comes to adaptation finance. It asks them to build, resilience in climate vulnerable countries. And so I think that's a really sort of important step in the right direction. And by the way, India also, I think there's a real leadership opportunity here. We're waiting for climate finance to sort of come to us from the developed world. But we do need to look at a range of domestic sort of funding or financing options to meet those gaps. We believe at the ICC, of course, that philanthropy plays a really important role, not in terms of amount, but in terms of catalytic opportunity. And again, I think the other big piece to sort of point out is that there is, again, a real need on this adaptation front or this adaptation piece to really get more data around some of the goals that we're going to set ourselves when it comes to adaptation. So the global stocktake, for instance, calls for national adaptation plans to be set in place by 2030. But these conversations, on global adaptation, they face a lot of really critical barriers. So for instance, how do we talk about global goals when your adaptation itself is so hyper local, so context specific? India has a national adaptation plan, but of course, we need more clarity, especially at the COP level. So we need to understand what are like more qualitative and quantitative goals in terms of really defined timelines in order to be able to finance what we're trying to do on the ground here in India. How do we get better visibility on metrics to really track adaptation progress? And by the way, what I say are gaps for India is very much consistent gaps across the global south. It's not just India that's facing sort of these constraints or these incredibly critical barriers. How do we structure commitments on finance? This is something that's come up in a big way around the loss and damage fund this year, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But there are these sort of really larger questions around how we're going to sort of map out some of these pieces on the adaptation front. And I think they really remain sort of very pertinent issues that we haven't really resolved yet. So anyway, that I think is one big piece, but that's just on adaptation. Yeah. As I mentioned, sort of there is one more critical factor this year, which is the loss and damage fund. It is a win. I do want to state that, there have been sort of criticisms about the amount not being enough, but I do want to point out, and let me actually maybe give, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay, I can. Sorry. I was just saying before I get into like the loss and damage fund, maybe I can just define what it is, because there might be a lot of people who are also confused by these very sort of technical terms that we throw out. Essentially, countries, of course, are battling, climate-induced extreme weather events, whether it's droughts, whether it's floods, whether it's cyclones, wildfires, you name it. Obviously, these events are having a tremendous impact on GDP, on vulnerable communities on the ground, and they are causing immense loss and damage. So what the fund really aims to do, and there were many calls for this fund over the last few years, is that the request is for this fund to provide financial assistance to countries who are deeply affected, by climate change. How do we protect those vulnerable communities? How do we, build in reparations when there is so much loss and damage? So I think India really recognizes the importance of this fund. Again, there are many, many aspects to figure out to this fund still in terms of how it's going to be operationalized. But I do want to say that the government of India has played a critical role in, this transitional committee that was set up on loss and damage in the lead up to COP28. It was established on the very first day of this COP. It is going to be hosted now for a certain period by the World Bank. They're going to play the interim sort of secretariat. And I think the amount that developed countries have pledged is around 720 million. And the idea is that it will, go to sort of very climate vulnerable countries, the worst affected countries, to sort of to respond to these climate change impacts. So it is a historic agreement. It is a win. I do want to sort of make sure that we frame it as such, even if, as I said, the amounts are, sort of can be ramped up, and hopefully they will be in the future. Lastly, I know that there's been a conversation on the fossil fuel piece, especially today. But I do want to say, rather than getting into the debate around phase down or phase out, it is very complex. There are many geopolitical reasons behind sort of these discussions and these conversations. I really want to actually emphasize that what we need is more global climate dialogue on adaptation, on resilience, on loss and damage, and of course on mitigation. But for me, we just have to broaden that entire conversation. And hopefully this year there was a step forward in doing that. I'll pause now. I know it's been a long, long dump, but yeah, hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, so adaptation, loss and damage, and fossil fuels, those were some of the highlights. The one thing that emotions are still. So, what were some of the top, your negotiations further?
So again, it's very, we always get into this sort of conversation around what worked and what didn't at every COP, and I think it is useful. But if I could again reframe it slightly to say, rather than focusing on where we as climate actors from developing countries like India can really play a critical role in supplementing the global climate dialogue. So yes, there will be all of these sort of pushes and pulls in terms of what should happen, what shouldn't happen. But how can we just have a more constructive conversation about it afterwards, instead of sort of coming back here and sitting with this resigned sort of sense of all of the things that could have been done. At least that's how we're trying to sort of think about it at the ICC. And so one of the things that we've really been trying to do is push sort of, both non-state actors, or rather civil society voices, both from the perspective of Indian philanthropy as well as civil society organizations, bringing these perspectives from the global south, from emerging economies, to a global platform like COP28 to really supplement the government of India's voice on that global stage. I think that's really critical. And so this year we've really increased participation of philanthropy. We've really kind of worked with the COP28 presidency to really platform the private sector in a big way. And I think that's really important, sort of making sure that there is this, component of like representative voices. There was a business and climate philanthropy forum that the COP presidency was hosting along with the World Economic Forum, etc. And they brought together like 500 CXO leaders across the globe. And we made sure that in those conversations around energy transition and finance and how the private sector can step up momentum on climate action, we made sure that there were representative voices in India, which again, historically has been a gap. There has been some representation, but not sort of in a very targeted and honestly in a really like, large, meaningful way. So that was really interesting. We took a large contingent of leaders, of philanthropic leaders, as I said. And so just to give you an example, we had someone like the CEO of the Tata Trusts who attended. He was on a panel discussion with really prominent financial institutions, like global financial institutions, weigh in on this debate around the finance that is required by developing countries for the energy transition. He was able to speak to the catalytic role of philanthropy and private sector, the need to work together, the fact that like there are sort of so many incredible opportunities and pieces of work happening on the ground in India, how India was addressing the transition. So it was really exciting. And I think, these are often conversations that are overlooked when it comes to developing countries. Some of the conversation is so heavily dominated by, global North representation, just because that is historically how it has always been. And so I think being able to add this perspective or complement sort of the government of India's vision, around all of the sort of efforts that they're putting in on universal energy access, on SDG progress, etc., while tackling climate change was really, really important. Like, we just had great representation from India this time. So that was really exciting. So again, just to sort of come back to the fact that, like, there will always be hits and misses, or as I like to say, highlights and lowlights. But you have to think productively around how you can supplement and support these global climate dialogues, whether it's COP or anywhere else. It's really important to kind of be additional to those processes.
Okay, I think that was a really interesting insight, right? Like having those dialogues, which, like you mentioned, hasn't particularly been happening. So, like, now what?
Hmm.
What are what what does it mean for India's goals leading up to maybe say next COP, or even 2030? Um, what what is the role that social, specifically businesses, can
Yeah.
play to kind of implement
I think it's a really important question, Shreya. You're cutting in and out a little bit for me, so I don't know if it's my terrible internet connection, but just just in case it's not. I was just going to say that, look, again, and this is a really important question, right? Because it's always about, we go through this giant emotional upheaval during these 2 weeks, and then we come back and we're like, what next? And I think while India has a range of mitigation and adaptation goals, it is making a lot of progress, as I mentioned, in its civil society, in its philanthropy, in terms of supporting all of these goals. And I think a few things that jump immediately to mind. The first is, and I mentioned this at the start, we do need better data on adaptation and resilience in order to meet priorities in those areas. Like, just to give you an example, one of the things that we're funding right now is something called the Climate Risk Atlas, which actually has been built out by the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, by CEW, which is one of the most prominent, climate policy think tanks in the country, headed by Dr. Arunabha Ghosh. And it's amazing work. India is a very at-risk, climate vulnerable country. We need hyper local and accurate data to drive disaster risk reduction, preparedness, as well as response. And in order to build, resilience for communities as well as businesses, as well as public investments, you really have to kind of make sure that you have the right data and infrastructure to be able to support those necessary sort of pieces of infrastructure. So CW, along with the ICC and of course ABLG Foundation, is actually building a climate risk atlas to assess climate vulnerabilities at the local and district level. And this is across 6 types of different risk indicators. And the granular data, I think it's really exciting. It's already being integrated into subnational action or subnational climate action. So that means at the state and at the local and district levels. So it's going into disaster management plans, it's going into government planning, it's going into sort of risk mitigation for programs and business investments, etc. So that is something that is a really amazing public good. So how do we invest in more data and infrastructure to sort of understand, measure, map resilience and adaptation priorities in India? That's like number one in terms of sort of what we need to build out. There are many, many things, but I'll try sort of focusing on that one. And there's one more, which is, I think, more visibility around, what are climate's priorities in India and what is the work that's happening on the ground. So how do we get not just more visibility, but funding for really sort of inclusive work, for the opportunity to kind of scale and build out this incredibly impactful work that's happening on the ground? How do we kind of just help spotlight that? How do we ensure that funding is going to the places that it needs to go to? There is incredible work happening on this ground, but it's not necessarily being scaled. It's not necessarily being replicated. we aren't building knowledge repositories around this work. How do we make sure that that's sort of, really kind of supported, and those ecosystems of support are built in the way that they need to be? Again, that's some of the work that we've tried doing at the ICC is building our platforms and products that will speak to these priorities. So how do we highlight and showcase the work of many, many different civil society organizations on the ground? We have a platform called Earth Exponential that does this, where we've done the due diligence across these, programs and projects across many, many institutions. But I think more broadly, like the point I'm trying to make is we need more capital, more technical capacity to scale existing work on the ground, and of course, to seed spaces where work has not yet begun. And I think that really is kind of the need of the hour as well, in terms of sort of finding more diverse solutions and ideas to tackle the problems that we're already facing. There's a lot happening on the ground, and I always say that's like the optimism or the hope or the positivity that I bring to the climate conversation all the time. And so does the ICC. We just need to figure out how to better support those who are doing the work that they're doing, and how do we build better enabling environments.
Right. What I think back from this that like you said, optimism and what um who want before we close, something that you think you might if you
Um, I think one thing to kind of take away from the whole sort of COP process, right, is it can be disheartening, if you're watching it from the outside and you sort of want to see more urgency and more action. I think one thing that we have to keep pushing for is also just more accountability in that process. And again, the reason I say things like the loss and damage fund are steps in the right direction is because we are moving towards greater accountability. Even sort of, draft texts that are, put together at the last minute that have inclusions of certain terms and certain things, eventually, like it may seem like too little, too late. And I appreciate that sentiment. I'm not going to lie, like we all live with that frustration. We work in the climate space, but I do want to also ensure that like we understand that the COP process is ultimately about building in more accountability, and that is really what we have to keep our eye on. From that perspective, like as I mentioned, there have definitely been some hits, some places we definitely need to push for greater and greater accountability. But let's also recognize when things are kind of moving in a direction that is actually calling for better mechanisms. And as I said, for me, like the focus on adaptation, the focus on loss and damage are critical sort of enablers, even if they aren't anywhere close to where we want them yet. I accept that.
I think that was very the second as well, like some of this position brought forward about where the viewers are but
Thank you so much. It was such a delight, Shreya. I really appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time. We really appreciate sort of you reaching out to us. We're big fans of IDR. Thanks for always having such a balanced perspective on mostly everything. And so really appreciate it again.
thank you, and I really appreciate you taking the time to schedule, considering that we're just back and forth. Video.
Thank you. Bye.